Thank you very much indeed. Now, I am a bit in awe because how do I follow such a great presentation on the high-speed rail and a specific project and so forth? So I also have to say thank you very much indeed to the two previous speakers, because they have actually taken a lot of the material that I was going to talk about and have talked about it already. So we're not going to be so delayed for tea or coffee. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to ISCA for inviting me to join you here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I'm absolutely delighted to have a chance to talk to you about sustainability, about trends, about emerging trends, and about global issues. I'm not going to give a presentation on specific projects. I'm not going to talk about specifics. What I'm going to talk about is trends, how global trends will affect infrastructure. I think what we'd like to talk about today, or what I'd like to talk about today, is actually there are three key themes that always pull through on the global trends. One is to keep in your mind the agility of markets to respond to change and the ability to do so. The second point is the changing markets. There are changes in the way that we're delivering infrastructure, and I'll talk about that in brief detail, point as we go through, and also about disruption. So disruption drives innovation. Innovation, despite its name, is not new. Innovation is what drives us going forward. It gives us the biggest opportunity for changes to the way that we're going to be delivering infrastructure as we go into the next decade or two. I've got four basic themes to the presentation today. The first is I want to talk about the trends. I want to look at the trends, and there are many, many articles that are written about global trends. There are many articles written about the top trends for 2016, the top trends for 2030, the top 5 trends, the mega trends, the super trends. What I want to do today is to pull together some of these trends and to highlight some of the issues that are affecting the way infrastructure will be designed and delivered as we go forward. One of the key things that I've noticed is that there is no normal. So no normal is the new normal. Growing populations are very, very key to the trends as we go forward. And that is not unusual either. Populations have always grown. I don't think there's been any time in history that populations have shrunk. Or maybe during some Black Deaths or something like that. But not usually do populations shrink. But it's the rate of change that is driving the opportunities for infrastructure as we go forward and improving people's lives. Also, asset management and the delivery of assets is becoming much more sophisticated, and digital is all. We do have a phrase in our company which says, "I think, therefore I app," which I think is quite nice, I must say. And if time permits, I'll talk about some smart solutions if I don't go through the podium here. So global trends for infrastructure. What do we want to talk about? Well, we see that the global trends are, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, relating to governments' efforts in relation to climate change. There is a huge focus in terms of climate change and resilience in terms of infrastructure. Green bonds, green financing, all these things that are said to have come out of COP21, but actually have been on the rise for the decade before that in places like China, etc., are very much a trend for the future. I think it's not just the delivery of resilient infrastructure, but it's also an imperative looking at what are the implications and what are the insurance implications if, in terms of cost as well as physical assets, if we don't actually build in infrastructure resilience into our communities as we go forward. Here in Australia, of course, we've got issues not just related to flood and the sea level rises, but we've also got issues relating to heat and fires and bushfires and so forth, which people often forget about. In COP21, everybody was talking about floods and sea level rises and forgot completely about the fact that bushfires actually are also on the rise and a significant trend going forward. Population growth and the rising middle classes and the aspirations of the middle class means that we are being driven towards delivering more, better infrastructure, reuse, repurposing of infrastructure, and regeneration of previous assets. in a sustainable fashion. It leads us to the idea about consideration of resources. Resources are absolutely fundamentally important. There is finite resource in the world. We do have to think about the use of resources. Mention was made about water. I will talk about that later. And also, we need to look at things like new materials, the costs, the technology, and the drivers for these new materials, how they can be used in the infrastructure world and how they can be used in delivering projects. And of course, as I say, there are smart everythings. So urbanisation, my passion is urbanisation. The context of urbanisation, I think it's really important to put this into context, because if you look at the fact that more than 50% of people currently live in cities, consuming more than 60% of the world's energy resources and generating 3/4 of the world's global emissions. That's a real challenge as we go forward. But if you think about at 2050, there's an estimated 2.5 plus billion people to be on this earth. How are they going to be accommodated? They need to be provided with telecommunications, with energy, with food, with water, with means to remove the wastes, with mobility. So let's just look for a minute at mobility. Mobility is an ever-evolving subject. We started off with horses and carts along a track, and we're now onto autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles are talked about, and it is a constant theme. Whenever you look at trends, you'll always see something about autonomous vehicles. The concept of autonomous vehicles being used in the cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Los Angeles, etc., as a regular feature is not so very far off if you listen to some of the pundits. Some people are saying they're going to be mainstreamed in 5 years' time. I'm not quite sure whether they will be mainstreamed in 5 years' time, but what I do know is that there are some serious issues around the legal and the security issues relating to autonomous vehicles. Technology has been proven, technology's been around and been used since 1972 and possibly before that. That's not the issue. The issue is the legal issue, which brings to us a moral dilemma. For example, the current discussion about autonomous vehicles must be programmed to protect the vehicle and the passengers within at the expense of anything else in its way on the road, or other road users, or even that child that dashes across the road to catch its ball or whatever. That child will be sacrificed for the sake of the vehicle and its passengers. That is a really big moral dilemma, and I know that there are many manufacturers of autonomous vehicles who are struggling with that at the moment. I think that is one of the biggest challenges to this future trend for autonomous vehicles. I also think it is a trend, though, that we will have to be looking at, and we will be seeing. There are many trials that are going on at the moment that are looking at how vehicles could be used on the road. But these are not interactive. These are not multi-use. These are not using autonomous as well as driver vehicles that have drivers in them. This is the issue as we go forward. Mobility is one of the ever-evolving issues, I believe. City responsibilities for smart cities. There are 8 fundamental responsibilities. All of these are interconnected, and all of these are fundamentally underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals number 9 and 11. These are really, really important. I think as we go forward, the trend is to understand more about the connectivity and the interrelationship between all of these elements of the smart city. We are needing to look at this in terms of the built environment, but we also need to look at it in terms of the social provision for people living and working and enjoying recreation in cities. We need to be very flexible in the way that we are providing our infrastructure. Resourceful world. I think this is one of the trends that has come from the World Economic Forum, and I really like the title because actually calling out the resourceful world is a very important point. So, the top 2 items, water and concrete, these are the 2 most frequently used materials in construction of infrastructure and the built environment. Water, we know, is scarce. There is a water shortage in many places, and in the world's fastest growing economy where there's most infrastructure being delivered, China, there's a massive water shortage. But looking at it on a global scale, the world could face at least a 40% water shortfall by 2030. That's not very far away. Water is the fundament of life. We can't live without it. It is, I believe, our limit to growth. Concrete, however, has a slightly happier note associated with it, because concrete has been around forever. It was around since the time of the pharaohs. It's been used in the pyramids and since then. But concrete also has got some competitors, and this is the trend that we need to be looking at, the new materials. So there are some new materials like the graphenes, the germanines, the silicines that are two-layered lattice materials that have got unique optical, mechanical and electrical properties that are very interesting in terms of construction and going forward. These materials will make concrete and steel look clumsy, redundant and old-fashioned. I think this is one of the trends that we need to be watching for, new materials and the use of new materials. There is a cost associated with them in the developmental stage, but that cost will come down significantly if the uptake is increased. I think it's also really important, though, to remember, as I said, that concrete has been around since the time of the pharaohs, and I don't think it's going anywhere fast. But I do believe that there are opportunities for new materials to be thought about. In terms of food needs, now you might wonder why, for an infrastructure conference, I'm talking about food. Well, actually, food has a massive connection with infrastructure and the provision of infrastructure. A small anecdote here is that China produces 50% of the world's vegetables. 50% of those vegetables are rotten before they get to market. And if you just cast your mind to the thought about how much water and energy has been used to grow, cultivate, harvest, transport, store these vegetables, and how much infrastructural energy use has been wasted in that process, that tells you that this is a big issue. There is a huge issue associated with the nexus of food, water, and energy, but that actually would take up quite a few conferences to discuss it. Key thing here is that there are challenges as we go forward in terms of resources. We need to use resources carefully. We need to think about how we use the resources, and we need to have resources very much at the front of our mind when we think about delivering on infrastructure going forward. Happily, we have some tools to assist. We have a lot of tools that we use in the built environment. There are, however, very few tools around that look at infrastructure. One was mentioned this morning, Envision. We know about Envision, so Envision is one of the few tools that is around. And also, we're here to celebrate ISCA, and we're here to celebrate the IS rating tool, which is, again, one of the very few tools that there are available to look at sustainability in infrastructure provision. Now, this is a very good point, though, to identify that this is a leading trend and a global trend. There is much more interest in terms of clients asking for tools to assist in optioneering, in assessing, and in delivering more sustainable projects. So the tools that I'd like to talk about today relate to carbon and the carbon portal, because this has also become an emerging trend over the last few years. Looking at carbon and looking at how you can use carbon to help optioneering and deliver better and more sustainable infrastructure is a very key trend and one to watch. So the carbon portal, optioneering. The carbon portal is an option evaluation tool which uses carbon data from comprehensive data sets. Imagine you have an urban development or a train network or a water treatment facility. This carbon portal will allow you to consider alignments, it'll allow you to consider options, it'll allow you to consider variants of the scheme under development, and will assist in the selection of the option and the lowest use of materials, the least disruption to the environment, and the optimal outcome in terms of sustainable designs. So some carbon tools exist in the world, but few of them actually take the carbon emissions, the designs, and integrate these with spreadsheets to come out with an emission factor at the end, which assists you in optioneering. So how does this work? So the carbon portal is calculating the carbon. So you identify your asset, you quantify your asset, and you get a carbon output. Looking at it as an example, here we have an example which shows the results. If you look at the far column, you can see that the results are analysed in terms of the design. So what you need to look at here is, where are the biggest opportunities for you to modify, change, or save carbon? So look at things like the pavement, which is over 40% of the carbon in this example is generated by the pavement component of the design. So that's a clue to where you start and put your energies for modifying, for changing, and for reducing carbon and reducing materials. Or look at it by scope. So you can see that construction materials are a significant contributor to the carbon budget on this example. Or then on the right-hand side, look at materials. Aggregates constitute more than 40% of the carbon in this example. So aggregates are where you should be focusing your attention. This helps us make decisions in a very rational, cogent and logical fashion. It also allows you to add costs associated with it, so you can actually not just save carbon, you can save cost. You can integrate the models and you can help deliver better and more sustainable infrastructure as you go forward. It was driven by a real-life application from Anglian Water, which is a service provider for water supply, providing service to its clients and its customers. I can talk more about this example if anybody's interested during coffee breaks. So then we come to digital and the digital future and smart infrastructure. There are many technology enablers. I've been enthusiastic here. Many technology enablers, and I think that time precludes me from going through all of these. We all know there are many solutions. There are many integrated transport solutions, intelligent transport solutions, smart transport solutions. There's much instrumentation and control. Not a day goes by without new technology being developed, being designed. Thousands of apps are being designed on a daily basis around the world for interoperability and so forth. What I'd like to talk about is security and data. Security, we've heard about the issue relating to the autonomous vehicles and the programming issues and so forth, but there's another element and another aspect to that. Imagine the scenario downtown Sydney, downtown LA, downtown Melbourne, London, where somebody hacks into the system and has a pile-up, causes a pile-up or causes crashes in the centre of the city. Imagine the chaos that would unleash. Imagine the civil unrest. It is actually a nightmare scenario that we don't really want to think about, but we have to think about it. So technology exists, the moral dilemmas are there, and then we've got the vulnerability. So going forward, I think the trend is certainly going to still move in the direction of technologies and so forth, but the vulnerability is a very big threat to delivering secure systems. Thinking of the other aspect, which is always very much on my mind when I'm thinking about vulnerabilities and asset management, thinking about the water supplies facilities. So where in the world are you precluded from walking up to a reservoir? Somebody who had a malintent could walk up to a reservoir, drop a vial of arsenic in, and could wipe out a city. That's always been a real worry for me. I'm a water engineer by background, and I've always thought that's a real worry. But this actually has increased. The magnification of the threat and the vulnerability has increased because of our ability and our interconnectivity in terms of the asset management and the use of technology in asset management for water supplies. Data management, Margaret mentioned that contractors love data and there's a lot of data and you like data because you get charts and so forth. Data is absolutely fantastic. Data is great. Collection of data is really important for us going forward in this profession and as we deliver our cities and our communities for the future. But we don't actually know what data we might need in 5 years or 10 years' time. So my plea is, Don't just think about the current needs of data. Don't just think about the data that you need for today and tomorrow's applications. Think about what you have no idea you will need your data for. Think about how you collect it, store it, and then how to be able to retrieve it. Too much data is out there on the mythical cloud, and people don't know how to retrieve it. Is there any use in that? Absolutely none whatsoever. Technology enablers. I just want to touch very, very quickly on the city of Barcelona in Spain. I see it's up here in one of the sustainable cities in the index for 2016, and justifiably so. About 30 years ago, Barcelona decided to implement a network of about 500 kilometres of optical fibre. This laid the foundation for the Internet of Things and the connectivity and the smart solutions that Barcelona has actually implemented for the benefit of its people. It is an amazing city. It's got a very interconnected water supply system. So if on the west of the city there is a high demand at one point, water can be moved across in a tunnel by telemetry to the west from the east, and so on and so forth. It's also got some of the first smart solutions for street lighting and so forth, and you can see that they've saved $37 million annually on having smart street lighting, which are sensor driven and so forth. It's also got lots of things to do with apps for parking, etc., but so have a lot of places. But it's got this bus shelter system, and it's got a series of bus shelters. And I really like this, and I have to tell you about it, because the bus shelters actually give you a very different experience when you're waiting for a bus. They're not just able to provide you with free Wi-Fi or be there for charging up your USBs or provide you with apps, but the bus shelters change their advertising protocols depending on whether there are men or women standing at the bus shelter. I had to ask the question as to how they determined whether you're a man or a woman. And anybody who wants to know, come and talk to me at the coffee break. But the key point about Barcelona, and what I wanted to say was, it doesn't just make good sense in terms of sustainability from the overall sense of the word, in terms of providing lots of interconnected facilities and lots of interconnected technologies. It also makes a huge amount of sense in terms of tangibility. So if you think that you're running a city and you can save $58 million per annum on water because of smart metering, that's quite a lot of money that can be moved somewhere else to provide other benefits for the city. You can also generate 50 million, or they have generated 50 million per annum in terms of parking fees. They've also, and I think this is very good, generated 47,000 jobs because of all this interconnectivity. So when people say that technology will take away all of our jobs, look at Barcelona. So a few examples of smart solutions. Let's look very, very quickly at this. Is an example from the oil industry, but it's an example of the oil industry where we're seeing innovation is generating opportunities for infrastructure supplies and delivery of infrastructure. This is an example of design and manufacture and assembly. This is an idea that I always thought was very much rooted in Hong Kong and Singapore's mentality for construction site and construction industry, because there's no space in these two cities. You have to actually do a lot of design and manufacture off-site, bring it on-site, clip it all together like Lego, and off you go. But actually, a lot of this is being driven by the North Shore oil industry and being taken up in Europe as the new wave of delivery of infrastructure. So you're designing infrastructure such that it can be constructed in a very different fashion. It can be manufactured so that it can be assembled like Lego pieces on site. It reduces the amount of time required for construction. It reduces the amount of labourers required for construction and the subcontractors, and it reduces cost, but it also reduces material wastage. So using an example from the North Sea oil industry where they take components out on floating barges and then clip them all together and Bob's your uncle, you have a North Sea oil rig. This is being used in the water industry in other parts of Europe. It's also being used in facilities such as waste-to-energy facilities where there are big pieces of equipment like incinerators and so forth. It will come to a city near you in the not too distant. So, prizes for guessing where this is. This is Sydney, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, very, very shortly, about innovation and looking at dynamic transformative components of the built environment. This is where we're looking at components of the built environment that are being designed not for their primary or initial purpose, but designed for future purposes that you haven't even thought about. This came to my mind because of a design competition that was run by the authorities here for one of the developments in the Bays precinct. And one of the ideas was a living bridge. So you can see that there's an openable bridge. This was a living bridge or a garden bridge, taking account of the fact that active transport is very popular here. People love cycling, people love walking, and connecting two of the communities across the bay where there's currently no connectivity. Not having any motorised vehicles on this bridge, having areas where you could sit, you could have a picnic, you could play games, you could have all sorts of recreational activities going on. You could have an urban orchard, you could bring farming back into the community, you could have this as an educational facility. This is a living bridge or a garden bridge, but this isn't new. There are fine examples still in existence in Italy of living bridges. The garden element of it was from the garden bridge in London, which has taken its reference to the living bridges that were particularly famous in Italy and in the UK. Another element here is the power station. So there is a disused power station on this particular site, and ideas were looking at you could use the power station to actually have battery storage and repower using battery storage, or you could recreate some beautiful facilities and put things in there like office accommodation or beautiful studio flats and so forth. The point about these examples are that they are giving us the indication that the trend is not for creating for the current purpose, but creating for the next purpose. And a good example of that is Olympic facilities. So in the London Olympics, the shooting range, I know very well, has been designed, it has been manufactured, it has been assembled, it has been used for the London Olympics. It has also been taken apart and moved, reassembled and used. It has been taken apart, moved, reassembled and used many times. So repurposing a facility is a very, very significant trend as we go forward delivering infrastructure. There are other examples, the High Line in New York, which is a very good example and a very famous example of reusing a facility that was an old railway alignment that had fallen into disrepair. It was socially an eyesore, not a very nice place to be. It has been opened since 2014 and in its first year had 5 million visitors and a very beautiful place to visit. Kuala Lumpur's Smart Tunnel in Malaysia, a really good example of taking a facility which was a road tunnel, primary purpose was a road tunnel, but actually having a secondary purpose to it such that if the rains came and the sensors were triggered because the water level was rising, the road tunnel would close and it would become a drainage storage tunnel. It would allow the traffic to continue in the CBD around Kuala Lumpur to move freely and be maintained, business to be maintained, because hitherto the business was interrupted because of the floods and so forth. When the floodwaters subside, the road tunnel is opened again. So using a piece of infrastructure for more than one purpose is a future trend, and it's not just one that is out there as hypothetical. It's certainly being adopted in many places around the world. And my almost last point is that I think I would like to say we follow trends, but innovation is what drives infrastructure. And to the point about innovation and the digital everything, I read a poem the other day, and I'd like to share it with you just to close as something slightly different. This is all about the global trend of technology being at the heart of everything, and the poet is a technology and digital poet. If you're interested, his name is Brian Bilston. And he writes, "For everything is just so, optimized into tyrannical perfection, 1,000 decisions and revisions, all the humdrumness of life outsourced to things far smarter than I." Thank you very much.